Good morning, everybody. Today we're going to be discussing matters that took place around this time 80 years ago. I'm going to be stepping out once again from the chronological order of how I've been discussing things building up to the Second World War. So I know at this point in my post I've been pretty much in 1935, 1936. But with this being the 80th anniversary of a very specific and very important moment, I felt it appropriate to discuss that. 80 years ago at this time, in Great Britain, the British populace waited anxiously to hear a radio broadcast from British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. 2 days earlier, Germany had invaded Poland, and everyone knew that was bad news for all of Europe, that the war was starting up again. And there was a considerable amount of debate in the House of Commons and in Parliament on what best to do about that. Do we act? Do we not act? Why aren't we doing anything about this sooner? Well, how do we prevent this? And more stuff about the gift of hindsight. And on this time, 80 years ago, Neville Chamberlain came on the air, and I'm summarizing his points, where he said the British ambassador handed a document to the leaders in Germany that if Germany did not withdraw its design, or at least state it's going to withdraw its design by 11 o'clock, he said that this nation would be at war with Germany. And he said basically Germany ignored them, they blew them off. And so he said after trying to do all this, and you can hear the sadness in Chamberlain's voice when he says those key words, and he says this country is at war with Germany. He had done everything he could to prevent war, and now here it is, it's right on his doorstep. He couldn't do anything about it. Pardon me. Now, history in a lot of ways has been very brutal with Neville Chamberlain over this. And once again, largely to do with the gift of hindsight. To really understand what Chamberlain did, you really need to go back to not a couple years earlier, 1935, actually far as back as 1936. Now, Hitler had been in charge for 3 years by that point, and he'd already been openly defying the Treaty of Versailles as it was. You know, he stated right out the gate, we're not going to pay this debt anymore, so all the debts to the reparations were gone. And then he began rearming Germany and also building an air force. Another way he was defying it. So he was already just, telling the Western Allies to go jump in a lake. And so in 1936, Hitler took his first big gamble. He decided to try to occupy the Rhineland, which is the western portion of Germany, which had been demilitarized as part of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, saying that there has to be unoccupied, Germans can't have troops there. So Hitler took a big gamble and took some of his newly formed army and tried marching into the Rhineland. And he knew he was taking a major gamble on this because the French army outnumbered him greatly. But he chose to do that, and the French chose not to call their bluff. Not because of cowardice, but France had already decided they'd already paid the price in blood once before, and they weren't very anxious to do it again. So Hitler got away with that. And what happens when bullies get away with things? It emboldens them, makes them want to do even more. And so, as things continue, Hitler did the Anschluss in early 1938, and by fall of 1938, he was pushing to take the area of the Sudetenland. That's an area that borders Germany and Czechoslovakia, because under the pretense that Hitler had said that he was going to unite all Germans under one banner in one country. And Sudetenland technically had a considerable amount of Germans in that area. But it also is where Czechoslovakia had a great deal of formidable defenses. And so Hitler was demanding that. And so it was agreed that they called a conference in Munich in the fall of 1938, where you had Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, Neville Chamberlain, and French Prime Minister Daladier. And they met to discuss this matter. Hitler didn't back down from his position, but he'd kind of tried to tell them that, give me what I want and we'll let it drop. And to sum it up, Chamberlain went from the position, same with Daladier, that if we give him what he wants now, hopefully he'll be civil and he'll finally just let it drop. But, they signed away the Sudetenland to Germany. And the Czechs were not even allowed to be there. The decision was made about their country in their absence. This would happen to Poland also later in the war, but that's a whole other story. Happened at the Yalta Conference. And they left, and Hitler, he actually scoffed at the French and the British on this, and he had one word to use to describe the British and the French. He just said worms. He basically just called them cowards. And while Neville Chamberlain is back in Britain saying, I secured peace in our time, showing that document, On the other side of Europe, you had Joseph Stalin, who was actually rolling his eyes at this, saying, okay, nice. Basically, why don't you just tell them just to invade us? Why don't you? Because everyone already knew from reading Mein Kampf that was his main goal, was the Soviet Union, and the British and the French are just going to hand over things to him. And he put it in words like, I mean, the British and French were wrong if they thought, quote, that the Russians are going to pull their chestnuts out of the fire. Basically, so you're going to leave our stuff in the fire while you take your stuff in the pan. You're going to give us the garbage. It's not going to happen. So Stalin had been trying to reach out to the West considerably on the matter, but the West was just as reluctant to talk to him because they viewed communism as a greater threat once again. And so Stalin put out feelers to Germany to see what they would want. He got to where he was willing to treat with whoever would treat with him. And so that's how he got interacting with Germany, because he originally tried with the West would have nothing to do with him on the matter. And so they signed the treaty in late 1938, the Munich Agreement, and in March of 1939, Hitler actually seized the entire country of Czechoslovakia. And it just built up and was getting worse and worse and worse. And on September 1st, as I mentioned before, the Germans staged border crossing by supposed Polish troops. Well, actually, they were prisoners from a German prison, inmates from a German prison, who had been putting uniforms on them to make them look like Polish soldiers, so they can shoot them on the German side of the border to justify doing it, justify invading Poland, saying, oh, we're just defending ourselves. So they actually invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, and leaving Britain and France with the horrible decision of what to do next. Throughout the war, France would be out of the war pretty quick. Both the United States and the USSR would kind of keep coming back to the point of, why is Poland so important to you? Not in those words, but Churchill just said, let it be remembered that England drew the sword for Poland. For them, it was a matter of honor. So, those are some thoughts on that. There you go.